Audacious Kids, we are in our Promises series, and today we're getting stuck into God's Word to discover another one of His great and precious promises for us. The promise we're looking at today is that God promises to never, everyone say never, to never ever leave us. Now, I don't know whether maybe you've ever been lost and you've felt how sad you've been when you've got lost and you couldn't find your parents or those you were with, or maybe you were playing with a group of friends and they went off into the stream and were playing with the stones and you didn't know where they were. Sometimes when we're on our own, we can feel a little bit sad and miserable, but God promises to never ever leave us. When I've been thinking about this, it reminded me of Toy Story. Now, I am a big fan of Toy Story. And we've got Woody, we've got Jessie in the story, we've got Buzz Lightyear, and many others. But Woody had a bit of a time because Andy went off to camp. And Andy didn't take Woody. Woody thought he was Andy's absolute favourite, that he would be with him forever. But when Andy went off to camp, Woody was left behind. He was left on his own, the super duper cowboy that everybody loved and wanted to be like. He was left alone and he felt very, very sad and alone. Now, maybe you felt like that. Maybe you felt alone at night time in the dark. I don't know, but maybe you need to be reminded today of God's promise, that God promises to never, ever leave us. Now, what does the Bible say about this? I love this verse in Deuteronomy, and I'm sure you may have heard this before. It says this in Deuteronomy 31, verse 6. Be strong and courageous. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or terrified, for the Lord your God goes with you. He will never, ever leave you. And this reminds me of our good friend Daniel. Who remembers the story of Daniel? He got up to some things, didn't he? Well, in the story of Daniel, there was a king, Darius. Do we remember the king Darius? And in the story of Daniel, he was abandoned by not just the advisors who were there, but he was abandoned by his friends. Daniel was all alone in a foreign country where he didn't speak the same language. And if you've ever been on holiday to somewhere abroad, they eat different food, things smell differently, they might dress differently. Everything was different. Daniel was on his own and he found himself. Do we remember where he found himself? He found himself. I'm not going to be a scary lion right now, but he found himself in the den of lions. He was all alone. And the Bible tells us when he was in the den, he looked to God and he wasn't afraid. Daniel prayed and trusted that God was with him. Daniel knew that promise. Daniel knew the promise that God would never ever leave him or abandon him. And Audacious Kids, we need to be reminded of this, that God will never ever leave us. And it reminds me a bit of, I've got my wedding ring here, and a ring is, let me put it back on, there we go. A ring is round, a little bit like a hula hoop, or the hula hoop crisps that we eat. A ring is round, and the Bible tells us that God's love is eternal for us. So it means it doesn't have a beginning and it doesn't have an end, and it goes on and on and on and on and on forever. And so Daniel knew that God loved him and would always be with him. So when he faced something really, really tricky and he was alone in the den of lions, he chose not to be afraid, but instead he prayed. He spoke to God, told God what was going on, even though God already knew, and he remembered the promise. Now, Audacious Kids, what can we do to remind ourselves of God's promises, that he will never ever leave us? And I've got 3 ideas to help us today. The first idea I thought we could do. This is my good friend Donnie who lives at my house. And you could rename one of your teddies or give it an extra name, your promise bear or your promise teddy. And when you see your teddy, you can remember God's promises. And when you give your teddy a big cuddle at night time or in the daytime, you can start to think about, but what are God's promises to me? Now, when I give Donnie a hug, I'm going to remember that God's promise is that he will never, ever leave us, because I need to be reminded of that sometimes as well. Another way we can remember God's promises that he will never, ever leave us is I've got a promise bracelet, and all I've done on some string, I've attached a bead, and I'm going to wear this bracelet. And so maybe, like you, could be at school, could be in the car, could be just having a moment where I'm feeling a bit sad and no one to play with. And I could just look at that and go, you know what? I don't need to be afraid. I don't need to be worried. I don't even need to be sad, because God promises that he will never leave me. So I might be on my own now because I've no one to play with, but God is with me. And a little bit like the bracelet, I like to call this the promise dot. And you could just put on a little teeny tiny dot on your hand in the morning. Check with your grown-ups first, because they might not want you to, but check. Pop a little dot on your hand. And during the day when you're writing your work at school or colouring in or even playing, you can be reminded that God is with you and he will never, ever leave you. Just like he never left Daniel. So, Audacious Kids, let's remember God's promise to us today. He will never, ever leave us. Have a good day, Audacious Kids.